What if I told you that Europeans used to look completely different? Over thousands of years, entire populations were replaced, mixed, and reshaped, leaving behind clues in one unexpected place: the human skull. Today, we're diving into my recent study that analyzed over 3,900 male skulls spanning 30,000 years. We're going to see how this anthropological data, combined with the rapidly developing paleogenetics, will reveal the surprisingly diverse past of Europeans. And the results are more dramatic than we ever imagined. Upper Paleolithic. Our story starts in the Upper Paleolithic, 37,000 years ago, because the first complete male skull found in Europe, Kostenki 14 from Russia, dates from this period. Although the population averages in my study are based on a summary of both complete and incomplete male skulls, meaningful comparisons can understandably only be made on the basis of complete skulls. I used 11 craniometric measurements, which are based on a system founded by the Swiss anthropologist Rudolf Martin. This system uses a combination of the letter M and a number. In addition, I used 11 indices ratios between these measurements, which express the shape characteristics of the skull. If you saw an Upper Paleolithic European today, you'd notice one thing. We're in a surprisingly good health and we're relatively tall, averaging from 175 to 180 centimeters, and those of the late period were very robust. The good health and remarkable height most likely resulted from the availability of meat from megafaunal animals and the low population density. The skulls of early Upper Paleolithic Europeans were also massive, with broad faces and large, powerful frames. Researchers used to divide them into two types: the rugged, Cro-Magnon type with massive jaws and the more harmonious Brno type. Although the differences in their cranial morphology were so pronounced that they would be obvious even to a layperson, we still do not know how these populations were related to each other and whether their morphological differences were due to different genetic origins. The fact is that the Cro-Magnon type appears to be older and can be traced to the populations of the so-called Aurignacian culture in the western half of Europe, at least 35,000 years ago. In contrast, the Brno type emerges during the subsequent era of the Gravettian culture, some 31,000 years ago, mainly in the eastern half of Europe. It is somewhat ironic, however, that the eponymous Cro-Magnon skull was found at a Gravettian site in France, and Gravettian settlements in Central Europe, such as Pridmosti in Moravia, contain skulls of both types. In any case, statistical comparison of complete skulls shows that cranial variability in the Upper Paleolithic was considerable, and the little skeletal material that has survived probably represents only its very fragmentary reflection. As the climate reached its coldest peak about 23,000 years ago, human stature shrank by about 10 centimeters in response to environmental stress, and cranial dimensions also decreased. However, they still differed strikingly from modern European skulls, and the averages of early and late Upper Paleolithic Europeans differ only slightly. Mesolithic, early Neolithic. During the Mesolithic period, which began around 9500 BC, human populations resettled the northern regions of Europe previously occupied by glaciers. Because the megafauna became extinct during the preceding Younger Dryas, perhaps as a result of a global catastrophe caused by cometary impacts, the availability of high-quality animal foods declined dramatically. In Western Europe, hunter-gatherers subsisted mainly on mussels, of which huge heaps can still be found along the Atlantic coast. However, their skeletons reveal that they were periodically exposed to periods of starvation, and their body height decreased further to almost dwarfish proportions. A rare exception were the fishermen from the Iron Gates area on the Danube, and later also the members of the Dnieper culture in Ukraine. Their fish-based diet probably explains why their height compares favorably with their Upper Paleolithic ancestors. The skulls of Mesolithic Europeans were similar in shape to those of the Upper Paleolithic, although they were generally taller and narrower. They tended towards a Cro-Magnon morphology with massive jaws, which is why we often encounter the term Cro-Magnioid type in the literature when describing ancient European populations. The fishermen of the Dnieper culture are particularly noteworthy. Their skulls were even more robust than those of the Upper Paleolithic populations, and if one can believe the claims of former Soviet anthropologists, the skeletal strength of Dnieper women was greater than that of contemporary Russian men. From 6000 BC to 3000 BC. Around 6000 BC, the continent changed forever. Farmers from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, began moving into Europe. This created a massive morphological clash. The farmers had smaller, more gracile crania with narrower, V-shaped faces. The small size of their skulls corresponds to their small body size, which was the result of a poor grain-based diet. Estimates of the height of Central and Western European farmers vary depending on the method used, but in any case, it ranged only between 161 and 168 centimeters. The most accurate anatomical reconstructions are at the lower end of this range. The European hunter-gatherers were pushed to the fringes of the north and east. In Scandinavia, members of the so-called pitted ware culture survived, while in the forest areas of northeastern Europe, the hunter-gatherer cultures of Pitcombe ware, Volosovo, and Nerva dominated. However, hunter-gatherers from present-day Ukraine were culturally influenced by the Caucasus region, and the first truly Neolithic farming culture created by native Europeans was the Sredny Stog culture. For 3,000 years, Anatolian farmers and the descendants of European hunter-gatherers remained physically and genetically distinct. They interbred only slightly. It was a stalemate of two completely different ways of life. Anatolian farmers never penetrated further into northern Scandinavia and the forests and steppes of Eastern Europe. The cranial morphology of these two groups also remained very different. During the fourth millennium, the skulls of Anatolian farmers began to shrink, which is likely related to the ongoing trend of shrinking stature as an adaptation to poor nutrition. They were also relatively lower, wider, shorter. However, this morphology was still very distant from that of Cro-Magnioid Europeans. The situation began to change at the end of the 4th millennium BC, when the so-called Yamnia culture formed on the basis of the Sredny Stog culture. It gets its Russian name from the fact that it buried its distinguished dead in pits, yama, under mounds, called kurgans. Members of the Yamnia culture were warlike herders, and their society was based on patriarchal clans. Thanks to a switch to a dairy diet and genetic selection, they were much taller than contemporary farmers. Their height is estimated at 173 or 174 centimeters, which was at least 10 centimeters, 4 inches taller. The Yamnia people subsequently swept across the continent and overwhelmed local farmers, who were decimated by a catastrophic epidemic of a bubonic plague. This wasn't just a slow migration, it was a genetic and social revolution, and it completely reshaped Europe. The era of the big migrations. Around 3000 BC, during the late Neolithic period, a clan of the Yamnia culture invaded what is now Poland and western Ukraine, which was inhabited by members of the agricultural globular amphory and Cucuteni tripilia cultures. This clash was apparently very violent, as evidenced by the recent massacre of a farming settlement in the Polish locality of Koszyce. The Yamnia men married local agricultural women, and this union produced a remarkable cultural and genetic mix, the corded ware culture. It is noteworthy that the skulls of this culture did not resemble the skulls of the Cro-Magnioid Yamnia people at all. Although they are similar to some local finds of the globular amphory culture, they are generally quite distant from the averages of local farmers and represent a completely unique phenomenon, the so-called corded ware type. The absolute length of the corded ware crania is comparable to the Neanderthals and Srednji Stog cultures, but their breadth was at least 1 centimeter lower, which created a very narrow, ultra-dolichocephalic shape with wide foreheads. Some corded ware groups continued west into northwestern Europe, where they further mixed with local farmers. Between 2600 and 2500 BC, this region became a source of massive population expansion characterized by the spread of distinctive bell-shaped beakers and archery equipment in graves. By 2500 BC, the bell beaker culture occupied a vast area between the Iberian Peninsula, the British Isles, the Jutland Peninsula, and the Carpathian Arc. The origin of the bell beakers would actually be the subject of a separate video. The roots of this ceramic tradition seem to lie in the Iberian Peninsula, and they arrived in the Rhine Delta only secondarily by sea. This is evidenced by the fact that the bell beaker people of the Iberian Peninsula differ dramatically in skull shape from the bell beaker people of the more northerly regions. While in Iberia, we would find a typically Neolithic skull shape, other bell beaker populations were characterized by short, broad skulls with broad faces, which were the complete opposite of the corded ware type. We refer to them as the so-called bell beaker type. Despite the fact that both the corded ware and bell beaker populations trace their origins to the Yamna culture, they ended up looking radically different. This shows just how fast human appearance can evolve when small groups of people become isolated. And we know that all of these populations were characterized by a very strong dominance of specific male genetic lineages, Y haplogroups, indicating that their physical characteristics spread through the founder effect of dominant males. Around 2500 BC, we would find 4 main population groups on the European continent, characterized by a very specific skull shape: the narrow-headed corded ware culture in Scandinavia and northeastern Europe, the short-headed bell beaker culture in Western Europe, the Cro-Magnon descendants of the Yamna culture in the Eastern European steppes, the catacomb culture, and the Poltavka culture, and enclaves of agricultural groups in the Mediterranean, who retained the original Anatolian morphology, for which the term Mediterranoid is often used in anthropological books. What about modern Europeans? My study ends with the year 2000 BC, but I intend to cover the rest of European prehistory from the Bronze Age to the present. For now, I can already say something about the differences between Europeans of the late Neolithic and Europeans of today. Here is the most surprising part. Modern Europeans don't really look like most of these ancient groups. Their skull shapes only partially overlap with ancient ones. Most modern Europeans have shorter, broader skulls compared to the long-headed warriors of the corded ware, and they are also very distant from the robust skulls of the Yamna people. Generally, they resemble either the morphology of the bell beaker people or the Anatolian farmers. Part of this is due to cranial plasticity. Our skull shapes change based on our diet, climate, and even our height. In fact, during the Little Ice Age in the Middle Ages, European heads became significantly shorter and rounder as stature decreased. It's only in the last 150 years, as life got better and we grew taller, that our heads have started getting longer again. Skulls thus reveal something genetics alone cannot: how people actually looked, and how dramatically that changed over time. And perhaps the biggest takeaway is this: the people of ancient Europe weren't just earlier versions of us. They were, in many ways, entirely different. If you are interested in the issue of prehistoric anthropology and population genetics, you can subscribe to my channel and add your comments.